Good evening. This is Martin Voelker. I'm chair of Jefferson County CRES, that's the Colorado Renewable Energy Society. I'm glad you can be with us. Tonight we're here from Ben Webster, PhD, on certified gas, promise, and perils. Ben is Director of Policy at MIQ, and he'll tell you more about what that company does. He has worked at the EPA, the US House of Representatives Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and CU Boulder. He received his PhD from Georgetown University and his BA from Bates College. And I should note that I got to hear Ben as the attending a conference at the Colorado School of Mines. It was called Responsible Natural Gas. I forgot the exact date, a couple of months ago. And it had a roster of important people in that domain. What it lacked was critics. It was all somewhat self-laudatory, and I bit my tongue because I'm really not an expert in anything related to natural gas or frack gas, as my eco friends would call it, until at some point Ben Webster spoke up and had a reasoned critique of the main title of that conference, Responsible Natural Gas, and I was really impressed with his nuanced take on certified gas, as it's sometimes called. And while I'm personally not a friend of fossil fuels, I still have to admit that I depend on them in my daily life, as all of us do. I'm just thinking it needs to find an end, and if it's a gracious end, we'd much prefer it. And it seems, or it could be argued, that certified gas at least has a few features to recommend it. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ben, who is now going to be able to share his screen and take over from here, and I will mute myself.
Well, Martin, thank you for the gracious introduction, and thank you to you and CRES for inviting me. My name is, as Martin noted, is Ben Webster, and I work for a not-for-profit organization called MIQ. I think that the first thing to note is that as a organizational position, MIQ is looking forward to that future when we have a renewable energy economy, or certainly a much more diversified energy economy. The reality is, though, if we're looking at today or tomorrow or even the next 5 years, is that we are in a place, both within the US as well as overseas, whether one is speaking about when one is speaking about energy security, that we are stuck with fossil fuels, and especially the use of natural gas as a fuel source. And so the as we'll discuss in a moment, the mission of MIQ is to limit the impact that natural gas can have on the climate, and specifically by limiting the upstream emissions, the leaks that take place before natural gas is combusted. And as many of you know, at the point of combustion, natural gas releases fewer greenhouse gas emissions than does its equivalent in coal. So from a fuel source to fuel source, we can look forward to natural gas being a better fuel than coal, although still having emissions at combustion, and unfortunately many emissions in the upstream. So moving on, what is MIQ? So MIQ is a not-for-profit organization, and as I noted, our specific focus is to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, and we're looking to do that this decade. And the means by which we go about pursuing that objective, and this will be much of what I'll be talking about this evening, is we've created methane performance standards for the certification of oil and gas facilities. And this is an approach which is effectively designed to move natural gas away from being a commodity product to a differentiated product. And by that, I mean that depending on the emissions profile, whether a well site or a facility is leaking a lot or very few emissions at the upstream site, the gas and production will be graded, and then consumers, whether utilities, industrial users, others, will be able to make their fuel choices based upon the grade. In other words, a grade of A would indicate a lower amount of emissions being released upstream. A grade of D would mean that there are relatively more emissions being released. A consumer with an interest in buying lower emission upstream gas will buy a gas that's graded A or certified A, and in doing so will put pressure on those operators who are performing more poorly to improve their operations. That's the general theory of change that MIQ has. As you'll see, we have a digital registry for tracking certificates, and that's a response to some of the failures in the carbon offset space. And we are currently working with online trading platforms to facilitate transfers. So MIQ is a not-for-profit that is facilitating the creation of a new market for differentiated gas or certified gas, and using those market forces to incentivize better performance in terms of emissions by operators. So what's the issue here? Methane, which is the primary constituent in natural gas, outweighs tremendously CO2 in terms of its global warming potential. On a molecule by molecule basis, methane is 82 times more potent, has 82 times more the heat holding potential than CO2. In other words, if methane leaks before it is combusted, it is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. And methane leakage rates from oil and gas range from 0 to 10%. So if we are seeing 10% of an operator's fossil natural gas that they have drilled, if 10% is leaking, that is a tremendous amount in terms of potential global warming potential. And currently, on an annual basis, the global methane emissions from oil and gas are the equivalent of emissions from all vehicles on the roads right now. So this is a very serious problem, but it is a problem that can be solved. The two other areas that are of note are how do we credibly determine the life cycle emissions? So what I was talking about a minute ago are the emissions associated with the production site at many of the well sites that we see driving around this area. But as natural gas moves through pipelines, how do we actually track those emissions through the pipelines? And how do we add methane emissions that are taking place in subsequent parts of the supply chain? And then finally, how do we compare asset level and LNG, liquid natural gas emissions from facility to facility and LNG shipment to LNG shipment? How do we be able to make decisions about this facility is doing better than that facility if we're using apples and oranges methodologies? So these are all issues that MIQ is interested in solving. So this is some base level information, and this is based on analysis that MIQ and Highwood Emissions Management, a think tank based in Canada, have developed. So if we, the bars here are a little bit out of order, but if I direct your attention to the bars on the right, the green space represents production, so wells and equipment at the drilling sites. The purple spaces represent gathering, boosting, processing, and transmission. Now, what the bar on the right represents are the EPA methane intensity numbers for the natural gas supply chain. And what we see here is an methane intensity of 0.33%. What that means is that 0.33%, 33% of gas is leaking out of the system. And that represents the production site. And on the purple area, we see 0.55, so a total, according to EPA, of 0.88%. And so nearly, according to EPA, bit less than 1% is leaking from the system. Now, the EPA's methodology is purely based on formulas and purely based on calculations. And effectively, how EPA has developed this using what they refer to as emissions factors are that if you have 10 valves that leak at such and such a rate, you would multiply 10 times that rate and come up with your overall emission amount. Now, when EPA developed its greenhouse gas reporting inventory, this emissions factor approach was revolutionary. It was very, it was a way of estimating and tracking emissions that really had not been engaged in before, certainly on a national scale. That was 10, 15 years ago. What we know now is that those emissions factors are, and we've known this for a few years, but what we know is that those emissions factors are considerably off. And now I'll direct your attention to the bar on the left-hand side of this graph. Here you see a total of 2.2%, 1% for production sites and 1.2% for the rest of the supply chain. This is the MiQ Highwood National Emission Baseline. And this is based on actual empirical information of over 367,000 measurements of aircraft overflights of basins across the country. And what we see here is a total emissions value of 2.2%, which is over double what EPA has estimated. And so 2.2% versus 0.88%. And so what we see from a national methane leakage point of view is that the situation in the US is considerably more dire than what we had understood through EPA's numbers and what the common conception is. This is not good news. The graph in the middle, the bar in the middle, is what I think we can hope to look at as good news. And this is just a hypothetical example, and we'll go into this in considerably more detail. But what this shows is that if natural gas going through the system goes through the supply chain, and all parts of the supply chain have received a grade, an MiQ grade of A, there would be a total emissions release of 0.25. So that is considerably less than that which the MiQ Highwood National Emissions number has shown. And so what that middle bar shows is that it is possible, using monitoring technology as well as policies and practices which are have already been adopted by a number of operators. It is possible to really drive down emissions at the well site and across the supply chain to leave a much smaller emissions footprint than is currently the case in most situations. So this is an important slide to get a sense of things are not great, but there is a path forward as we look to natural gas as a bridge to get us from where we are today to that energy economy, which is dominated by renewables. So a lot of words on this slide, but this is just an overview of MiQ's performance certification. As you'll see in a few slides, we have developed certification standards for each section of the natural gas supply chain, including liquid natural gas. The performance for these assets are graded on an A to F scale. And because we have certification standards for each section of the supply chain, we have a common methodology allowing emissions intensity or methane intensity to be summated through the supply chain so that the natural gas, when it is combusted or bought by a utility or moved onto an LNG cargo ship, it is a supply chain emissions value can be determined. The certificates that accompany MIQ certified gas can be used by the operators to track their Scope 1, greenhouse gas Scope 1 emissions, or they can be used by other entities for their Scope 3 reporting elements. So this slide is just some graphics of the various certification standards that MIQ has. You'll see here we have standards for onshore production, offshore production, LNG cargo, for gathering, boosting, and processing, for transmission and storage. A very key element here is that all of MIQ standards are publicly available. We believe very strongly that if a market-oriented approach for driving down methane emissions is going to be successful, the process needs to be certainly credible, and all elements of it need to be transparent. So you can go to the MIQ site today and download any of these documents to determine how is the standard, how does the standard work, and how are grades generated. So here we have a simple graphic of the MIQ certified supply chain. As you can see here, we have icons representing production, gathering and boosting, processing, transmission and storage, and liquefaction. And each of those, if we do have a certified supply chain, each of those elements would be graded and the methane intensity summed across those. So this is the key element. These are kind of the guts of the MIQ standard. So what we have here above the kind of rainbow colors are three boxes titled 1, 2, and 3. The first is these are the elements that constitute the MIQ standard. So the first is methane intensity, and the methane intensity of a particular operation will be graded. So as you can see here, if the methane intensity of a facility, of all the wells and equipment owned by a particular producer in a given basin, if they have a methane intensity of less than 0.05, they would receive an A. If they are leaking gas at rates greater than 2%, they'd receive an F. Monitoring technology means what type of technology do they have in place, and we require to get an A, B, or C that they have multiple aircraft, drone, or satellite overflights on at least a semi-annual basis. And then third are company practices and policies. And these are the formal policies that a company, an operator, will have in place to ensure that leak detection and repair is taking place correctly. So under the MIQ system, each of these will receive a grade. So we can imagine that methane intensity receives an A, monitoring technology they receive an A, but they don't have very good policies and practices written down. They receive a D. The safeguard in the MIQ system for certification is that the operator will receive the lowest of those three grades. So regardless of the good grades received in this hypothetical for methane intensity and monitoring technology, if they received a D for company practices, they would receive a D overall. This certification is re-upped on a annual basis, and so the operator would have the opportunity between the time the first certification takes place and the next certification to ideally improve the operator's performance. So this is really the key element about how the grades are determined. So as I noted before, it is we feel that for a certified gas market to be successful, in other words, in order for certified gas to realize the potential of driving down upstream methane emissions, that a certain set of principles must be put in place. If any of these principles are not in place, we would argue that the gas is not certified gas, and that it's something else, because it does not entail these key definitional criteria. So the first is that a certified gas program must have transparent standards. In other words, any member of the public, a regulator, should be able to reach out, download, and be able to understand what is the certification standard. And in other sectors, this is a very common practice. The second element is moving clockwise around the graph on the right, are third-party audits. So if a particular operator, let's say BP, determines that they would like to have their facility certified by MIQ, they would sign an MOU with MIQ. There's no transaction fee involved with that. They would put in place their monitoring equipment, and then a third-party auditor would go out into the field, spend time at the BP facility, and look at their monitoring data, interview employees, and look at their company policies and practices, and also do a field inspection of wells and equipment. That third-party auditor has no connection to MIQ. We engage with about 11 different engineering firms who have auditing and verification capacities. We train them under the MIQ standard, and then the operator will contract with that third-party firm to do the audit. So this is a very similar process to a corporation engaging with an accounting firm to do their financial audits. So the auditor has no financial relationship between, no financial incentive in the outcome of the certification. That's a key element. The third element is a registry. So after the auditor goes in the field and produces the audit report with a recommendation for a grade, MIQ will review that and assign the grade if we agree, which is very likely the case, if we agree with the auditor's determination. And a certificate, a digital certificate of representing 1 MMBTU of gas will be assigned for production at that facility. So if a facility was to, in the month of January, produce 10,000 MMBTU of gas, they would receive 10,000 certificates. Those certificates are stored in a MIQ's digital registry. And this is essentially an accounting system. It does two things. Whenever the gas, that certificate, which is stored in the registry, that is represents the gas. As the gas is sold, the sale will be noted in the registry, and title will transfer from the original owner to the new owner. And as trades are made through the system, that title will change so that we understand what the chain of custody is the whole way through. The key element there is that at the final point of sale, when a utility buys the gas to use it for power and the gas is combusted, the certificate will be retired. And what that means, having a certificate stored in a single source of truth, a single registry, is that no double counting can occur. And that notion of double counting is something that we've seen in the carbon offset space, whereby a company may buy a tract of forest to offset its CO2 emissions, and there have been cases where that same tract of forest has been sold to another purchaser seeking similar carbon offsets. So in that situation, we would have two owners or two corporations utilizing the same forest tract and double counting those emission offsets. So having a single source of truth, a single registry, disallows that, which is important from a carbon accounting perspective. Finally, in the lower left, we have asset-wide certification. What MIQ requires is that all wells and equipment that a company owns within a basin must be certified. We do not allow the certification of any single pieces of equipment. That allows for cherry picking and raises doubt about what the certification actually consists of. So another way of describing this is oftentimes in oil and gas operations, there will be newer wells and older wells, or newer pieces of equipment and older pieces of equipment. And some of those newer pieces of equipment are less leaky, and some of the older pieces of equipment are more leaky. They release more methane emissions. Some certifiers allow for the certification of only a subset of wells in a basin, and oftentimes it ends up being the wells that are performing better. That gives a false view of the methane emissions performance across the entire facility, which raises doubts in the eyes of the public, of environmental groups, of other stakeholders, including regulators, as to what does that number actually mean. And it really gets very close to greenwashing. So certifying the entire facility, all wells and equipment, disallows that from happening. So this rather complicated diagram is, and I won't spend too much time here, but this is our schematic to show how the relationships between third-party auditors, between facility operators, between methane monitoring technology companies are distanced from MIQ in order to reduce conflicts of interest. So here we have a graph showing in more detail how MIQ certifies at asset scale. We define that as all contiguous, commonly operated, owned or managed assets in geologic basin or field. As we were talking about earlier, that ensures that no cherry picking takes place. In the graphs on the right, you can see what some of these basins or fields may look like. So here we have a overview of the different types of monitoring technology which are available, and these range from drones through handheld sensors through to satellites. And the key here is that there's no silver bullet. And we recommend a tiered approach. Tiered coverage is the way to move forward. I think a good example here is that handheld sensors can be pick up on a lot of or they can be very sensitive to methane leakage, but they are not efficient for going around an entire facility. A satellite, on the other hand, is very efficient for looking at an entire facility, but has much lower resolution in terms of being able to see small leaks. So using a handheld sensor in combination with a satellite is an example of how two different pieces of equipment can provide redundancy and assurance over a facility. So what we have here is, and this is another slide speaking to this, source level inspections, meaning where's the leak coming from. Those can be looked at through handheld OGI sensors, and facility scale inspections can take place through satellite, drones, and aircraft. So I think here we have a explanation for why a more nuanced approach is necessary for determining methane emissions. And this is also a explanation for why EPA's emission factor data is not correct. In the graph on the right, you will see a purple box, and that curved line moving through that box represents the values that would be captured from albeit in an estimated form, the values that would be captured through emissions factors. In the green box, and the emissions factors, another way of referring to that is through a bottom-up inventory. The green box has a number of cells in it, intermittent malfunctions, venting, liquids unloading events. None of those events are planned, and as such, they were not worked into EPA's emission factor calculation. And so MIQ standard takes into account those elements and requires that operators report on any of those events taking place, and those are factored into the data and subsequent grade assigned by the MIQ auditor. So the key here is taking into account unplanned events is as important in determining our methane emissions as our understanding of methane leakage from pieces of equipment. So the final step here I want to talk about is company practices. This is the third of the three cells upon which the grade is determined, and in the box on the bottom we see the elements that some of the elements that are that consist of that company practices set. These are include company culture, emission source mitigation, operator training, operations procedures, leak inspection strategies, and emissions reporting practices and protocols. So the MIQ digital registry, we discussed this earlier, acting as a central authority to avoid double counting. Okay, so one of the key things about MIQ is that at the same time that we have avoided conflicts of interest by not selling any technology, by not hiring any auditors, that same approach allows the MIQ certification standard to scale extremely quickly. We rely on other actors in the market to help implement the MIQ standard. By that, I mean, if we look at the central cell here, the central box, we see a number of companies, AECOM, SLR, SGS, who are serving as auditors. As more business develops, we anticipate more engineering firms, more auditors becoming involved. And on the right-hand side, we see over 20 different technology providers which provide a whole set of monitoring technologies. So in other words, MIQ does not itself, as an organization, does not have to scale with increased certification that takes place under the MIQ standard. Rather, we will engage with and approve other third-party entities on the tech side and on the auditing side to engage with the actual work involved in certification. On the right-hand side, we see a number of the operators involved that are getting certified under the MIQ standard. BP, ExxonMobil, Chesapeake, EQT are amongst the largest operators in the country. We have a number of other mid-range and smaller operators as well. And both utilities and manufacturer or industrial entities are buying certified gas from these operators. So here you can see our growth in certifications and certified gas. We are currently certifying over 195 billion cubic meters a year of gas. That is nearly, that works out to be nearly 20 BCF, billion cubic feet a day of gas. And that is representative of approximately coming close to 20% of US onshore gas production. So we have been certifying since late 21, and so it's been less than 2 years, and 20% of onshore production is being certified under MIQ standards. And going back to that original bar graph, while not all of those producers, not all of those operators are receiving A grades, all of them are receiving C or better grades. And the total methane emissions under a C grade are considerably better than what we're seeing from a national perspective. This is a graph which I'll go through very quickly, which indicates that MIQ's certification approach, the selling of certificates associated with the gas, has been designed to emulate the natural gas, the sale of natural gas, both domestically and internationally. So the next two slides are examples, but I think they give a good sense of how the MIQ system works from a supply chain perspective. So what you see in the left-hand column under segment are the different areas that MIQ certifies. And in this case, we have a 400 million MMBTU, which are in this hypothetical situation have been produced. They received an A grade as they moved through the system. They received different grades. The grades are associated with the third column, the methane intensity. So when they're produced, they had a methane intensity of 10 grams per MMBTU. This at the gathering boosting stage, an additional 30 grams of leakage, 10 grams of leakage at gas processing, and 20 grams of leakage at transmission and storage. So what this shows us is that by the time the buyer buys this gas, there has been a methane leakage of 70 grams of MMBTU over the entire supply chain. And then the onshore buyer can use that figure for their scope 3 emissions. They can also make a decision to buy gas which has a lower leakage rate. And that's what this next slide shows us. Here we have in these two tables a hypothetical LNG shipment for A and hypothetical LNG shipment of B. We see A, that gas has done pretty well. It was a grade of B at production, and at the liquefaction plant, it had a grade of A, resulting in a total of 0.15%. While shipping, it had a methane intensity of 0.07%, resulting in 0.22%. And finally, when it goes through regas or regasification, it's an additional leakage, resulting in a total of 0.27%. LNG shipment B, on the other hand, has gone through a much leakier supply chain. And when the gas goes into grid after it's been gone through the regas plant, it has a methane intensity of 0.87%. So the buyer between these two, the buyer could look at these two shipments, and if they are interested in buying natural gas with a lower methane intensity, they're going to buy from shipment A. So I think this ability to sum together certification and the associated methane intensity across the supply chain is a very powerful tool in providing information to the buyers. And just as importantly, that signal of LNG gas from shipment A being bought is going to send a strong message to all the elements of the supply chain involved with shipment B that they need to improve their operations going forward, or else they're going to continue losing market share. So with that, that is the end of my presentation, and I would be more than happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing screen.
Okay. Yeah, that was interesting. I like the level of detail and also the frank admissions that were inside that presentation. For instance, one of the really poignant things was that the EPA massively underestimates the emissions that are actually happening.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you came back to that when you said this had to do with these unplanned or events.
Unplanned events, yes. Now, there's one important element here that as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, EPA has been instructed by Congress to revisit their emissions factors and include empirical data. So the proposed regulations have been released in the past few weeks, and MIQ's feeling is that that EPA has, for the most part, got it right, and that their next set of emissions factors are going to be much closer to reality than the old set. So we feel that they are moving in the right direction.
So I have one nagging suspicion around this because from where I'm coming, I've always looked at this stuff as more or less greenwashing and making an industry look like they're on their toes when in fact only small percentages are even affected by this. So my specific question would be, at some point, European Union or might have just been France refused to buy LNG from the United States because they also made a calculation where they said the entire transport chain is so fuel heavy that what arrives is no longer a defensible fuel.
Yeah.
Obviously, that position immediately changed when natural gas became unavailable due to the Ukraine war. But could you speak to that?
Yeah. Yes. So that would that yes, that was France that had declined that shipment, and I think that was one of the major wake-up calls for the U.S. industry, that they needed to engage in better practices to be able to show buyers, both domestically and overseas, that the reputation of U.S. gas might not be might not be the case, but also to demonstrate what the methane intensity is. And the key point is that as good consumers, we should not we should not always take at face value the statements of any particular operator in any sector. And I think that's where the value of an organization like MIQ can come into play, that we are a third-party entity, and we are not, when we certify, we are not saying certified yes, no, or certified good, bad, but rather we're putting a value onto it. And we are saying A, B, C, D, E, F. So we're putting a rating onto that. And utilizing a third party that can track across the entire value chain will give a sense of credibility to the emissions that are associated with gas being imported into, in this case, Europe. Now, what I think is really important from a European perspective, and they are working on this, is that I think to truly make that case, they need to apply that same argument to gas coming in from Algeria and gas coming in from, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, gas coming in from Russia, whether pipeline or shipped. And this is the importance of being able to set up a global standard so that we can make apples to apples comparisons of gas from this region is not good, or gas from this particular basin and facility is good.
Yeah. So, but I think the basic underlying question is, can quote unquote better or less emissive gas ever reach a percentage in worldwide production that is meaningful, or would that be elusive? What's your?
Well, I think our perspective is that that low emission gas can certainly reach levels that that will have global effects. And the reason for this is, and this is where we feel that market incentives are absolutely key. There's the greater the potential for market share that a particular operator has, means that other operators are losing out on that market share.
Now,
and
is that a theory, or is that actually happening?
Well, I think
the reason I'm asking is sometimes in divestment movements, for example, people sell their share in war industries or so, and then the only thing that really happens is somebody else buys those shares. Same thing with, let me just call it bad gas. There will won't there always be buyers for the bad gas?
Potentially, Yeah, I think there's going to be a whole range of I think the element in moving away from natural gas as a commodity and to something that is a differentiated product is that there will always be different grades of gas, and different buyers will make different decisions on what is important for them in terms of what type of gas are they looking to buy. The point, though, is that the primary point is that compared to where we are today, the ability to institute incentives to lower emissions in gas puts us in a much better place than if we were to do nothing at all and just work on business as usual.
Okay, and I suspect that maybe some of this is also a move by industry to preempt mandatory limits by governments, as they are somewhat unlikely in the United States, I have to admit, but might be more likely in the European Union.
Yeah, well, I think the regulations that are being put forward within the U.S. are probably the strictest in the world, and certainly in Colorado, the state of Colorado has amongst the most progressive regulations in place for limiting emissions. So those federal regulations, which I noted, are not yet in effect. But for example, the Europeans, the EU is currently considering new oil and gas policies. They are calling for one of the versions of the policies that they are considering called for methane emissions reporting for LNG shipments coming into Europe, so that each cargo would have a emissions value associated with it. In the US, under the Inflation Reduction Act, a methane fee will be put into effect. And what that means is that a large operator, a large oil and gas operator that is emitting methane emissions at rates greater than 0.2% will have a quite significant fee or fine associated with emissions levels above and beyond that 0.2%. That's going to create a significant regulatory incentive for operators to lower their emissions. Now, where I think certification can take place, where I think the regulations and certification play together, is that in that 0.2% level where the methane fee kicks in, that's a grade of C under the MIQ system. So operators, if in the pure regulatory world, an operator that is emitting at a rate of 0.19999% has no incentive to improve their emissions performance. If you add on a market system or a certification approach, they have now an incentive to go from 0.1999 to get a B grade of 0.1 or an A grade of 0.05. So utilizing these two elements together can keep on incentivizing operators to continue improving their performance.
So one question here is, will buyers pay more for the A grade gas than a lower grade?
That's a good question, and that's still to be determined. This is a very new market. So early days, and as I noted before, MIQ has just been certifying since late 2021. So education about the certified gas space is still needs to take place, not only within the operator community, but also within the consumer community. Now, there's some
of the operators. Do you have a sense of how much money operators spend or need to spend for compliance with certification and for monitoring? Is it a trivial amount or is it substantial?
Given the levels of revenues that oil and gas companies have been making over the past year, it is marginal. There are certainly costs involved, especially for very small operators or very large operators who have lots of facilities. There are costs involved, and the auditing element is not insignificant either. However, compared to overall revenues, it's quite small. And as a result, we are seeing premiums between non-certified gas and certified gas, where certified gas is 1 cent to 5 cents in premium over traditional gas. That works out to be a range of, I think, 30 cents to $2.50 extra in household energy costs.
Sorry, I muted myself instead of unmuting. Question from Bill. He's asking, would this be a definition of certified gas? And the definition would be methane that has been produced with less than a specified limit, perhaps 2% of associated leakage to the atmosphere.
I think it's a good question as to what the formal definition is. I would probably use a different definition, and I would, this is actually something that MIQ is working on to come up with a formal definition. So this is kind of a work in progress. But a definition of certified gas is gas that has been certified by a third-party organization to express its methane performance, and then utilizes a transparent standard, a third-party auditor, and use of third-party technology, and certifies across the entire facility. So it's kind of a multi-part definition.
Yeah, on the methodology side, here's a question. It's longer, I'll just read it. It sounds like MIQ assumes that most operators will rely on a combination of technologies like long-pass drones, satellites that can more frequently scan for larger leaks, and handheld monitors like FLIR cameras that can detect smaller leaks, performed less often and require trained employees. The question here is, do you see a place for Environmental Defense Fund's methane SAT in the MIQ verification process once it's operational? Also, are there any operators like Chevron using MIQ in the Denver Jules Basin in Colorado?
Yeah.
First, can you explain what the methane SAT SAT?
Yeah, sure. So EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund major environmental group, is very involved in and has played a very important role in looking to reduce methane emissions. And they've been very, very active in Colorado, as a number in the audience are probably aware. As part of their overall methane reduction efforts, they have invested in and a satellite called Methane Sat, which will be, when launched, and I think it's meant to launch in the next few months, which will orbit over oil and gas production areas and monitor and report on any large-scale leaks. So in answer to the question, yes, we would certainly include data from EDF's methane sat, even if that is not the satellite that a particular operator is using for their methane leaks. If a third-party satellite like EDF's was to go over and identify a leak, that would be, and we were informed of that, we would tell the operator, or the operator, if they were informed, would be obliged to tell us, and that methane leak information would be integrated into their overall certification data. So yes, we think that's going to be a helpful and an important piece of technology. Regarding the whether MIQ is certifying any facilities in the In Colorado, we are not, and we would certainly look forward to developing those relationships. But at this point in time, we do not certify any facilities in Colorado.
Okay, and here's a question. Intriguing. Does MIQ plan to add distribution lines into the mix? And I appreciate the question because it is a bit confusing.
Yeah. Yes. So the answer is absolutely. And as the questioner is likely getting at, we are distribution lines are amongst the leakiest part of the supply chain, and we have certification standards which encompass the entire supply chain and take into account distribution lines. We are currently we have the standard, we do not have any operators who have started to become certified on their gathering and distribution lines.
On that note, a related question from somebody else was, how do you handle pipelines intermixing different grades?
Yeah, sure. Yep. So this is going to be a similar idea as the RECs of renewable energy certificates. The certificate can be bought or sold in a bundled fashion, which means that as gas moves through a pipeline and moves from a pipeline to a compressor station or processing facility and so on, as it's bought and sold, the certificate will effectively track with the physical gas. It can also be sold in an unbundled capacity, which means that if certified gas is being produced in the Appalachian, in Pennsylvania, that the certificates representing that clean gas can be sold to someone in California. And so the individual in California is, or the entity in California is buying those attributes. But because those certificates are tracked in the digital registry, they are not going to be double counted. So there's only one certificate representing that that lower emission gas, even though it's being separated from the physical gas. So this is a very similar concept to here we are in the Front Range area. You may have Excel, you may check the box saying I would like X amount of my energy to come from renewable energy. We have no idea if the electrons that are coming through our wires are actually from wind turbines or a solar farm. It could be that Excel is buying RECs from another facility. And so the energy we're receiving could come from a coal-fired power plant, from a natural gas power plant, but the RECs represent the renewable energy that's being bought. So that unbundled certificates in the certified gas space operate in the very same way.
Yeah, note to self, I think at some point we'll have to do an event on RECs because they've been criticized recently.
Yeah,
it's really ineffective in creating more renewable energy.
Yeah.
Apparently 95% of the stuff would have been built with or without RECs. But I have another question, or two actually. One is, how is not-for-profit different from non-profit? And the other caller had wanted to know how MIQ pays their salaries.
Yeah. So no difference between not-for-profit and non-profit. We are a not-for-profit organization, and we are dependent on, we have two sources of revenue. The first and the by far primary source is philanthropic donations. So in the same way that EDF, Sierra Club, NRDC receives information from donors. We receive philanthropic donations as well. The second and much smaller source of revenues is every time there is a title change in the digital registry, there's a small transaction fee, and that goes towards the cost of running the registry. So it's a fee for service per se.
So one question I would add is, you're probably not alone in that space. What does your competition look like, and why would operators choose one or the other?
Good question. Good question. So within the certification space, there are three primary certifiers within North America: MIQ, Equitable Origin, and Project Canary. Equitable Origin is a nonprofit like MIQ based in Canada, and Equitable Origin certifies on the basis of a number of attributes in the oil and gas space. So they look at water impacts, community relations, indigenous rights, and they touch on methane, not in the same depth that MIQ does. So if an operator is interested in getting certified across a range of attributes, we've seen different oil and gas companies use both EO, Equitable Origin, and MIQ for the joint certification. And the Equitable Origin utilizes those same set of principles: transparent standards, third-party auditors, third-party technology usage, facility-wide certification. They use the same set of standards that we do. The third entity, Project Canary, is a Denver-based certification company. They are for-profit, and they have a quite different business model than MIQ does. And I can't speak for Project Canary's approach, but it is the principles that we think are very necessary for a credible certified gas market are not necessarily shared by Project Canary.
Yeah, I was trying to find her name. I mean, one big caveat that I would also want to issue, even though there are various technologies that are all used in parallel, the whole measuring issue is a thorny one.
Yes.
I mentioned I attended this responsible gas forum, and one of the professors, an Austrian statistician, I can't find her name right now, Ursula, I believe. She gave some practical examples of how incredibly difficult it is to make these measurements, and put some real limitations on it. So how hopeful are you that this mesh of different measurements can at least give a good approximation?
Yeah. So a few thoughts on this. The first is that the technology used for monitoring and measurement is still very nascent and can be imprecise. And we can see significant error bars associated with the readings of given pieces of technology. The second element is that the goal of certification, the goal of this space is not to measure and determine what methane intensity is to the 4th decimal point. The goal is to drive down methane emissions. So that is why our MIQ's methane intensity consists of ranges as opposed to exact figures, because we don't feel that it is reasonable nor probably responsible to assume that a given monitor can determine exactly what amount of methane is being released. Then there is the issue of how do you take the data from all these different instruments, as well as different types of instruments, and put it all together and produce an output that means something. And that's called reconciliation. Reconciliation is a very tricky task. So these methodological and technological issues are a major reason that MIQ has that 3rd pillar in its standard, which is the company practices and policies. And what we have found is that the company practices and policies are a pretty good proxy for the amount of methane emissions or methane leakage that's taking place. For example, if a company has very thorough policies and practices on its books, we have found that they're doing a pretty good job in keeping emissions low. On the flip side, a company that doesn't have very good policies in place, the emissions are often higher. So we view the company policies and practices as holding equal weight in our standard as the use of monitoring technology and the methane intensity element. And that's, I think, an important element, an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about the space, as well as kind of the MIQ standard.
Okay, I think maybe one last thing. Do you have a perspective on how long we'll still have to deal with fossil gas?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is no. And I think the more the faster that, and I think a key element is the we here, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But let's just look at the US. The more incentives or subsidies that the government can put in place to incentivize the use of renewables on both the utility and retail or residential scale, the faster that transition is going to take place. So the answer to your question, Martin, is a contingent one. Kind of what are the factors, either market-based or policy-based, which are going to encourage that transition? Now, the reason I said we is that the energy economy is obviously a global one. Okay. And in addition to fuels being, in many cases, being able to be transported and traded globally, we also have to consider the situation faced by very large numbers of people in regions around the globe that currently do not have energy security in place. And it is, I think, going to be a reality that fossil fuels in some case will serve in the future as a bridge to pull these many millions of people in Africa, in Asia, out of, in some cases, energy poverty. And so the question is, what type of practices, policies, incentives can be put in place to mitigate the use of fossil fuels in those areas? And so I think the question of when do we get off fossil fuels has to be looked at in terms of that kind of energy, from an energy poverty point of view as well. Kind of a case in point, Pakistan has a tremendous amount of coal reserves. As Pakistan develops, I think it is in the interest of all of us that those coal supplies are not used for their power plants. So is natural gas a bridge for Pakistan to be able to improve its economy, improve the life of people there? Moving to a straight to a renewable energy economy, I think is in those places is questionable in terms of how realistic it is.
Well, we'll see about that. Our organization, the Colorado Renewable Energy Society, would certainly prefer if those incentives you were speaking about went to the renewable energy side and fast, include an international perspective. So with that, I think we've exhausted the questions, and I thank you for giving us an overview over this in part somewhat arcane, but on the other hand also pertinent issue, and I really appreciated seeing this whole picture, however one might think about priorities or the necessity.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Ben.
Thank
and
you.
hope to see you around.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.